G'day ladies and gents, Cubic Meter here. In a previous video I introduced the Infinibore, a fully autonomous mining machine that can excavate thousands of blocks in a couple of hours. This was a great proof of concept, however, it was slow and inefficient. Oh, and did I mention it was slow, as in really slow? For example, it will take over 2 hours to excavate this chunk of land. So let's see if we can use some intelligent engineering to accelerate this design into the world's fastest tunnel bore. So what is currently limiting the design? Well, it has something to do with the fact that we are only releasing one TNT at a time. This isn't compounded by the fact that we need multiple TNT in each position and a lot of TNT in lots of different positions. In fact, right now, the Infinibore is processing roughly 11,500 TNT at roughly 12 game ticks per TNT, which is the reason why it will take almost 2 hours for it to complete this excavation operation. Up in the top right of my screen, you can see a tool implemented by a mod by Sensei known as the Chunk Debug. This allows us to visualize the chunk loading in our world, and what we are seeing is the chunks that are being loaded by the TNT warping through the terrain and exploding at its final position. And something that's important to note is that if a chunk happens to be border loaded, like I am with my player right now, the TNT will collide with that chunk and not be able to phase through it. But each time a TNT warps, it will only load the destination chunk for 2 ticks. And while this machine is running side to side, there are many other chunks which could also have TNT in them. This offers the tantalizing possibility of being able to parallelize the TNT being released in multiple chunks at the same time. Currently, the biggest bottleneck with lazy loaded cannons is a mechanism known as the entity separator. This solves the problem of being able to create one gigantic batch of TNT with pre-programmed positions that they warp to, and then releasing that TNT one at a time to ensure it reaches that position unimpeded by other TNT loading chunks. It works because what happens when this batch of TNT starts moving is the first TNT that start moving will move onto this pressure plate powering the pressure plate, which will also cause the trapdoor to close, meaning that any TNT that tries to move after it will collide with this trapdoor. And the problem is that this mechanism is fundamentally limited by how quickly this pressure plate will reset after being triggered, because while the pressure plate is powered, this trapdoor is closed and we can't sort the TNT until it opens again, and then we can separate out another TNT. A solution would be to have multiple entity separators, that way the other separator can run while the other one is idle. So this will effectively double the speed that we can release TNT. And conveniently, we already have a machine which makes use of multiple entity separators stacked in a conveyor. But this creates another problem. We now have 2 separate batches that need to be programmed with the same velocities in order to run them in parallel. If we try to visualize our problem, we have our terrain subdivided into a grid, and we want multiple TNT delivered to each position on that grid. We charge the velocity of TNT in batches and then separate them horizontally. Currently, entity separators only pull out a single TNT at a time, but ideally we want to be able to dive into the stack and scoop out a bunch of TNT at once. Then we can load these bunches onto the conveyor and release them in parallel. To create these batches, you want to take something like 200 TNT and then separate them into batches of 100 TNT. But the entity separator will only ever respond to the first entity in the stack, meaning we'd have to run the entity separator 100 times in order to get exactly 100 TNT. So what can we possibly do to ensure that we only need to run the separator once to get that exact 100 TNT? Well, the trick is to insert another entity into the stack after the first 100 TNT then use that entity to trigger the separator, allowing exactly 100 TNT to pass through before the trapdoor closes. This effectively means that we can separate out whatever amount of TNT we want by simply dispensing an entity such as a minecart between a set amount of TNT in the same stack. This is the groundbreaking innovation that we need to increase the speed of our tunnel bore. After a lot of time and development, we now have the new and improved Infinibore. With each payload we dispense a minecart down below, which will perform the stack indexing for the separation stage. This design is even easier to build due to the simplified conveyors optimized to be more compact for greater blast intensity. There we go. The payload is ready to be separated. Here comes the first batch, and then immediately after it, another batch. And so now we're running with multiple batches of TNT in parallel to get the maximum speed possible. Here we go. And look at that. Absolute speed demon. And here is a neat trick given to me by Sava for dealing with the item lag you might experience when loading the area after excavating it. That's right. We give the first TNT in each position a single tick longer fuse time so it explodes before the items are ticked, killing the items before the game even starts to lag. Of course, if instead you want the option to keep the items, you can simply flick this lever to disable this function. Let's go ahead and set this up for a larger excavation. And thanks to the massive lag optimizations, we can now bump this all the way up to 33, which is the maximum operational spacing. There we go, set up for one operation. Let's hit the button and go into spectator. There we go, there's about 7 minutes and it's just finished charging the payload. Now we can start blasting. You can see with a much larger payload the lag starts to spike a lot more. However, once it gets into the conveyors, it's actually surprisingly lag efficient. If you have a look at the chunk debug, you can see the chunk loading going absolutely crazy from all of the TNT flying all over the place. And that might actually be a problem, because we should only be loading the position where the TNT explodes and not every chunk leading up to it. This means the lag will increase with distance, which will kind of defeat the purpose of having an infinite tunnel bore. But can we just take a moment to appreciate how much more lag efficient this design is? Like, check this out, we can tick warp, and it even finishes way faster. Like, look at that. I think that was about 13 minutes to clear out this entire area. That is 10 times faster than the previous Infinibore design. But back to our previous point about the chunk loading, let's bump up the range by a significant amount, and then see what happens. Oh boy, now we're loading a lot of chunks, and things are getting really laggy. My goodness, look how far it's shooting. Yeah, so this is a big problem. We do not want to be loading all of these chunks, because that is just redundant usage of the game's performance in order to load all of these chunks into memory. Fortunately, Rhythm and Intricate were able to help me figure out that the chunk loading is caused by the TNT ray casting to check for blocks that counter the effects of fall damage. Yes, apparently, TNT executes codes meant for entities to take fall damage, despite TNT being completely unaffected by fall damage. Mojang. Fortunately, it turns out that the fix for this chunk loading issue is actually quite simple. All you need to do is place a climbable block, such as vines or a ladder or scaffolding or anything that would cancel fall damage if you were to pass through it, and it actually just straight up blocks the raycast made by the TNT, meaning that now we are only loading the destination chunk and none of the intervening chunks. So that is the new and improved Infinibore. But if you want to use the machine yourself, I'm going to have to go over some instructions. Just like the previous design, we need to chunk align the machine. However, this time we also need to sub-chunk align it, which means these cubes also need to line up with these blue lines that you can see depicting the sub-chunks within each chunk. You can also control the height at which the TNT explodes at by moving around these blocks in the conveyors. You can also offset every second one in order to increase the height of the ball, but make sure you also bring down the climbable blocks to block the raycasting so it doesn't lag excessively. The payload count is now exactly equal to the length of the conveyor divided by 2. So for example, this conveyor is 192 blocks long and requires exactly 96 TNT per payload. If you happen to max out the lecterns for the length of your tunnel bore, you'll need to go down to the bottom here and increase this counter to add additional payload counts between each minecart. I also found that the optimal payload count multiplier is 4. However, if you increase the counter down there, you'll need to take whatever amount is in that counter and multiply it by the payload count multiplier. And finally, if you find that your tunnel bore is a bit too long, causing a bit too much lag for your game, you can come down to this hopper clock and increase the interval to slow the machine down. And of course, if you need more details about how to set the machine up, be sure to check out the previous video that goes into much more detail. As for me, I'm now satisfied that the Infinibore can live up to its full potential in making insanely long tunnels which are useful for mining. If you want to learn more about cannon tech, be sure to check out the TNT archives where there's lots of skilled people with lots of experience. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.